The Monkey's Paw by Jacobs. Part 1. The night was cold and wet, but in the small living room the curtains were drawn and the fire burned brightly. Father and son were playing chess, the father putting his king into such sharp and unnecessary danger that it even brought comment from the white-haired old lady knitting something placidly by the fire. "Hark at the wind," said Mr. White, who, having seen a fatal mistake after it was too late, was trying to stop his son from seeing it. "I'm listening," said the son, seriously studying the board as he stretched out his hand. "Check." "I don't think he'll come tonight," said his father, with his hand held in the air over the board. "Mate," replied the son. "That's the worst of living so far out," cried Mr. White with sudden and unexpected violence. "Of all the beastly, slushy, out-of-the-way places to live in, this is the worst. Path's a bog, and the road's a river. I don't know what the people are thinking about. I suppose they think it doesn't matter because only 2 houses in the road are let." "Never mind, dear," said his wife calmly. "Perhaps you'll win the next one." Mr. White looked up sharply, to see a knowing look between mother and son. "There he is," said Herbert White as the gate banged shut loudly and heavy footsteps came toward the door. The old man rose with hospitable haste and opening the door, was heard condoling with the new arrival. The new arrival talked about his sadness. Mrs. White coughed gently as her husband entered the room, followed by a tall, burly man, beady of eye and rubicund of visage. "Sergeant Major Morris," he said, introducing him to his wife and his son, Herbert. The sergeant major shook hands and, taking the proffered seat by the fire, watched contentedly as Mr. White got out whiskey and tumblers. After the 3rd glass his eyes got brighter and he began to talk. The family listened with growing interest to this visitor from distant parts, as he squared his broad shoulders in the chair and spoke of wild scenes and doughty acts, of wars and strange peoples. 21 years of it," said Mr. White, looking at his wife and son. "When he went away he was a thin young man. Now look at him." "He looks so good," said Mrs. White politely. "I'd like to go to India myself," said the old man, "just to look around a bit." "Better where you are," said the sergeant major, shaking his head. He put down the empty glass and sighing softly. "I should like to see those old temples and the street jugglers," said the old man. "What was that you started telling me the other day about a monkey's paw or something, Morris?" "Nothing," said the soldier quickly. "Leastways, nothing worth hearing." "Monkey's paw," said Mrs. White curiously. "Well, it's just a bit of what you might call magic, perhaps," said the sergeant major, offhandedly. His 3 listeners leaned forward excitedly. Deep in thought, the visitor put his empty glass to his lips and then set it down again. Mr. White filled it for him again. "To look at it," said the sergeant major, fumbling in his pocket, "it's just an ordinary little paw, dried to a mummy." He took something out of his pocket and held it out for them. Mrs. White drew back with a grimace, but her son, taking it, examined it curiously. "And what is there special about it?" asked Mr. White as he took it from his son, and having examined it, placed it upon the table. "An old fakir put a spell on it," said the sergeant major, "a very holy man. He wanted to show that fate ruled people's lives, and that those who interfered with it would be sorry. He put a spell on it so that 3 different men could each have 3 wishes from it. His manners were so impressive that his hearers became aware that their light laughter was out of place and had hurt him a little. "Well, why don't you have 3, sir?" said Herbert. The soldier looked at him the way that the middle-aged usually look at disrespectful youth. "I have," he said quietly, and his face whitened. "And did you really have the 3 wishes granted?" asked Mrs. White. "I did," said the sergeant major. "And has anybody else wished?" continued the old lady. "The first man had his 3 wishes." "Yes," was the reply. "I don't know what the first 2 were, but the 3rd was for death. That's how I got the paw." His voice was so serious that the family fall silent. "If you've had your 3 wishes, it's no good to you now then, Morris," said the old man at last. "What do you keep it for?" The soldier shook his head. "I did have some idea of selling it, but I don't think I will. It has caused me enough mischief already. Besides, people won't buy. They think it's just a story, some of them, and others want to try it first and pay me afterward." "If you could have another 3 wishes," said the old man, eyeing him carefully, "would you have them?" "I don't know," said the other. "I don't know." He took the paw, and holding it between his forefinger and thumb, suddenly threw it upon the fire. Mr. White, with a slight cry, quickly bent down and took it off. "Better let it burn," said the soldier sadly. "If you don't want it, Morris," said the other, "give it to me." "I won't," said his friend doggedly. "I threw it on the fire. If you keep it, don't hold me responsible for what happens. Pitch it on the fire like a sensible man." The other shook his head and examined his possession closely. "How do you do it?" he asked. "Hold it up in your right hand, and wish aloud," said the sergeant major, "but I warn you of the consequences." "Sounds like the Arabian Nights," said Mrs. White, as she rose and began to set the dinner. "Wish for 4 pairs of hands for me." Her husband drew the talisman from his pocket, and all 3 burst into laughter as the sergeant major, with a look of alarm on his face, caught him by the arm. "If you must wish," he said gruffly, "wish for something sensible." Mr. White dropped it back in his pocket, and placing chairs, invited his friend to the table. At dinner the talisman was partly forgotten, and afterward the 3 sat and listened to the soldier's adventures in India. "If the tale about the monkey's paw is not more truthful than those he has been telling us," said Herbert, as the door closed behind their guest, "we shan't make much out of it." "Did you give anything for it?" asked Mrs. White, watching her husband closely. "A trifle," said Mr. White, coloring slightly. "He didn't want it, but I made him take it. And he pressed me again to throw it away." "Not likely," said Herbert, with pretended horror. "We're going to be rich, and famous, and happy." Smiling, he said, "Wish to be an emperor, father, to begin with, then you can't be henpecked." He ran quickly around the table, as he chased by the laughing Mrs. White armed with a piece of cloth. Mr. White took the paw from his pocket and eyed it doubtfully. "I don't know what to wish for, and that's a fact," he said slowly. "It seems to me I've got all I want. If you only paid off the house, you'd be quite happy, wouldn't you?" said Herbert, put his hand on his shoulder. "Well, wish for £200, then, that'll do it." His father, smiling and with an embarrassed look for his foolishness in believing the soldier's story, held up the talisman. Herbert sat down at the piano and struck a few grand chords. "I wish for £200, said the old man distinctly. The old man screamed in fright. His wife and son ran toward him. "It moved," he cried, with a glance of disgust at the object as it lay on the floor. "As I wished, it twisted in my hand like a snake." "Well, I don't see the money," said his son, as he picked it up and placed it on the table, "and I bet I never shall." "It must have been your fancy," said his wife, regarding him worriedly. He shook his head. "Never mind, there's no harm done, but all the same it gave me a shock." They sat down by the fire again. Outside, the wind was higher than ever, and the old man jumped at the sound of a door banging upstairs. An unusual and depressing silence settled on all three, which lasted until the old couple got up to go to bed. "I expect you'll find the cash stuffed in a big bag in the middle of your bed," said Herbert, "and something horrible sitting on top of your wardrobe watching you as you pocket your ill-gotten money." Herbert sat alone in the darkness looking into the dying fire. He saw faces in it, the last so horrible and so simian that he stared at it in amazement. It became so clear that, with a nervous laugh, he felt on the table for a glass containing some water to throw over it. His hand touched the monkey's paw, and with a little shiver he wiped his hand on his coat and went up to bed.